Long before the world trembled at the sound of Viking longships, before kingdoms burned beneath their axes, there was only the land cold, merciless, and raw. Scandinavia, the cradle of the first Vikings, was not a place that forgave weakness. It was this land that made the first Vikings. Here, winters dragged on like prison sentences. Snow swallowed the ground for months, choking the life out of crops. The sea, black and restless, slammed against jagged fjords with a rage that could splinter ships. Wolves prowled the forests, and hunger stalked every hearth. To survive in this place was no accident. It demanded iron will, ruthless strength, and a heart unbroken by endless hardship. The legend of the first Vikings began. Imagine standing on a windswept cliff in the north, the icy spray of the sea cutting your face like knives. Below, waves smashed into black stone, booming like drums of war. Behind you stretched forests so vast they seemed eternal, dark, whispering, filled with unseen predators. And in the villages scattered across this unforgiving world, the people learned a simple truth: life was war. They fought against the cold, against hunger, against their neighbours. And from this constant struggle emerged men and women, harder than steel, sharpened by suffering, tempered by storms. These were not peasants, scratching out a meagre life. These were wolves in human form, waiting for the moment when their hunger would spill beyond the fjords. The sagas say the gods themselves were born from chaos, Odin from the clash of ice and fire, Thor from thunder and storm. And so too were the first Vikings born from chaos. Each child was a test. Could they survive the cold nights when food ran out? Could they grow strong enough to carry a shield before their voice had even deepened? The weak were left behind. Only the strongest endured. But there was more than survival in their blood. There was ambition. The sea, cruel though it was, offered something the frozen earth could not: escape, opportunity, riches waiting beyond the horizon. When the first boats were carved from pine and oak, it was as if demons had sprouted wings. The sea no longer kept them trapped, it gave them claws. And so the legend of the first Vikings began, not with kings or crowns, but with nameless warriors staring out at the horizon, hungry for what lay beyond. They had no need to conquer their own land, it had already conquered them. The only way forward was outward, across the waves, toward new lands, new plunder, and new terror to unleash. Before the Vikings were raiders, before they were conquerors, they were survivors, carved by ice, shadow, and suffering into a people so relentless that the rest of the world would come to know them by a single name, whispered in fear: Vikings. In the north, childhood was never gentle. For the people who would become the first Vikings, to be born was to be tested, not coddled, not sheltered. The moment a child drew breath, the cold winds of Scandinavia struck them like a challenge. Survival was never guaranteed. Infants were bathed in icy water, a ritual that shocked the weakness from their lungs. Those who did not survive were considered too frail for the harsh life ahead. Those who did lived their earliest years in the grip of hunger and frost, their lullabies the howling of wolves beyond the firelight. The north wind was a teacher, and it was merciless. It taught boys to harden their skin against snow and storm, to run barefoot over frozen ground, to wrestle each other until blood stained the ice. It taught girls to gather, to fight, to heal, and to wield an axe with the same fury as their brothers. In this world, there was no such thing as softness. There was no childhood as we know it today. Childhood was preparation for war. A Viking child's toys were weapons: wooden swords, small axes, and shields carved from scraps of timber were thrust into their hands before they could even walk steady. By the time they were 7, many could hurl a spear farther than a grown man in the south. By 10, they had learned to sail, to hunt, and to gut a fish with steady hands. The north wind had no patience for weakness. It demanded strength, and only the strong grew into adulthood. Stories filled their nights. Around fire pits, skalds sang of gods who betrayed and bled, of giants who devoured the sun, of wolves who would one day swallow the moon. The children listened with wide eyes, and from those tales they drew lessons. The world was cruel, but cruelty could be mastered. The gods themselves lived in struggle, and so must they. Even play was training for blood. Wrestling matches left bruises and scars. Stone-throwing games hardened arms. Winter hunts forged hunters who could track prey through snowstorms, their breaths ragged, their stomachs empty, their eyes burning with hunger. And always, the sea called to them. They would stand at the edge of the fjords, staring out at the horizon, daring the waves to swallow them. Small boats were their classrooms, the tide their instructor. From the north wind they learned resilience. From the sea they learned daring. By the time these children grew into men and women, they were no longer simply survivors. They were wolves raised in blizzards, steel tempered in ice, flesh and bone shaped by storms. The rest of the world raised farmers, monks and kings. Scandinavia raised predators. And when these children of the north wind became adults, they would unleash terror upon the world in ways no one could yet imagine. Before the first Vikings ever carved their longships, before their axes shattered kingdoms, they were bound to their gods' deities, as fierce and unyielding as the land itself. These were not gentle gods of peace and mercy. No, the gods of the north demanded blood, sacrifice, and unshakable loyalty. They were born of chaos, raised in violence, and they mirrored the lives of the people who worshipped them. Odin, the Allfather, was not simply a wise ruler. He was a god who had torn out his own eye in exchange for knowledge, who hung himself on the great tree Yggdrasil for 9 nights just to grasp the secrets of the runes. To the first Vikings, Odin embodied cunning, sacrifice, and the relentless hunger for power, a hunger that flowed in their own veins. Then there was Thor, god of thunder, protector of mankind. His hammer, Mjolnir, was said to smash mountains, to crush giants, to split the sky itself with every strike. To children, Thor was a hero, a symbol of courage. To warriors, he was the raw fury of battle, the storm made flesh. When the first Vikings went to war, they called upon Thor to guide their blows, to let their axes fall like lightning. But their pantheon was not filled with heroes alone. The Vikings also revered gods of chaos and destruction. Loki, the trickster, wove lies and betrayals, teaching that cunning could be as deadly as steel. Freya, goddess of love and war, demanded beauty and blood in equal measure. And Hel, ruler of the underworld, waited with cold patience for all those who would never see Valhalla's golden halls. These gods did not promise eternal peace. They promised endless struggle. Even the afterlife was no rest. The bravest warriors sought Valhalla, where Odin's chosen fought and feasted each night, only to rise again the next day to fight once more. It was a vision of eternity that reflected Viking life itself, battle without end, struggle without pause. To honor the gods, the people gave offerings, sometimes food, sometimes weapons, and sometimes blood. There are whispers in the old sagas of sacrifices made in sacred groves, of men and women hung from trees as offerings to Odin, of animals slaughtered so that Thor's storms would pass, or Freya's blessings would fall upon the harvest. In every storm, they saw Thor's wrath. In every betrayal, Loki's shadow. In every raven that circled above the battlefield, Odin's watchful eye. The gods were not distant. They walked beside them, breathed through them, demanded their loyalty and their fear. And so, the first Vikings became not just warriors, but living reflections of their gods. Cunning like Odin, fierce like Thor, unpredictable like Loki, unyielding like Hel. The rest of the world prayed for peace. The North prayed for strength, for war, for death worthy enough to join the gods themselves. And with such gods whispering in their ears, it was only a matter of time before the first Vikings turned their gaze outward to unleash divine terror upon the world. Winter was the first battlefield of the north. Long before Viking ships prowled the seas, blood was spilled upon frozen rivers and ice-crusted fields. In a land where the sun vanished for months, the cold was a predator in its own right. It crept into lungs, froze skin, and drained strength. To live through winter was a war, and not all survived. Food was scarce, and hunger drove men to desperation. When stores ran low, neighbours became enemies, and raiding was born not from greed, but from sheer survival. The sagas speak of the first feuds fought in these dark winters not for gold, not for glory, but for grain, firewood, and the meat of livestock. Families clashed with axes and spears in snow that ran red, and the ice beneath their boots cracked with the weight of their rage. But these winters forged something terrifying, a people who could not be broken by hunger, frost, or fear. While kingdoms to the south closed their gates against the cold, the Norse sharpened their blades and turned on each other, growing stronger with every drop of blood spilled. Children watched as their fathers fought duels on the ice, settling disputes with steel. They learned early that survival was not given, it was taken. To hesitate was to die. To show weakness was to invite death. And so, every battle, no matter how small, became a lesson in ruthlessness. The snow itself became part of their warfare. Warriors learned to move silently across frozen ground, to strike from blizzards, to vanish into white storms, as if the land itself swallowed them whole. To outsiders, it seemed sorcery. To the Norse, it was survival turned into art. There are tales of villages wiped out in a single night, their fires extinguished, their halls ransacked, their people carried off into the storm. When the sun returned in spring, travellers would find nothing but blackened timbers buried in melting snow, silent tombs of winter slaughter. And still, the people endured. Each feud, each raid, each bloodstain on the ice bound them closer to the destiny that awaited. For in these brutal winters, the first Vikings were tempered like iron in a forge. Hardship became strength, death became familiar, killing became second nature. Other lands raised farmers who feared famine, soldiers who dreaded the cold. Scandinavia raised wolves who thrived on both. When the sea ice finally cracked and the fjords opened to the restless tide, these hardened people looked outward. They no longer fought only for survival. They fought because war had become a part of them, as natural as breathing, as inevitable as the thaw. And so, the first Vikings stepped from bloodied snow onto saltwater ships, ready to carry winter's fury into the world beyond. The North gave its people no gifts, only stone, wood, and iron, buried deep beneath unforgiving soil. To survive, the first Vikings learned to master these raw materials, bending them to their will, shaping weapons that would one day terrorize the world. In the smoky glow of blacksmith forges, the heartbeat of Viking destiny pounded on anvils. Sparks leapt like stars as hammers rang against iron, each strike echoing the fury of the gods themselves. These were no ordinary weapons. To the Norse, a sword was not just steel, it was an heirloom, a spirit, a vessel of honor and vengeance. Every weapon told a story. Spears were carved from ash trees, believed to carry Odin's blessing. Shields were painted with colors and symbols, turning a simple board of wood into a warrior's second skin. And the axe, the tool of every farmer, became a terror in war. In the hand of a Viking, an axe was more than a weapon. It was a statement, blunt, brutal, impossible to ignore. But the most feared of all was the sword. Few could afford one, and fewer still could wield it with true mastery. Forged with painstaking care, often passed from father to son, these blades were seen as living things. They bore names whispered with awe: Legbiter, Widowmaker, Bloodfang. To carry a named sword was to carry a legend at your hip. The forging process itself bordered on the sacred. Some smiths were said to mix bone ash into the steel, binding ancestors to the blade. Others quenched the red-hot iron in blood instead of water, believing it made the weapon thirst for war. Whether truth or myth, each weapon carried with it the weight of belief, and belief made men fearless. For the first Vikings, these weapons were not just tools of survival. They were the keys to freedom. With axe and sword, they could take what the land denied them. With shield and spear, they could carve their place in the world. Training began young. Children swung wooden sticks until their arms ached, learning how to strike, how to block, how to kill. By the time a boy could grow a beard, he was expected to wield real steel without hesitation. Girls, too, trained with weapons, for every hand mattered in times of raid or feud. Blood knew no gender in the north. It was this culture of steel that separated the Norse from their southern neighbours. Where others prayed for peace, the first Vikings prepared for war. Where others saw weapons as a last resort, the Norse saw them as extensions of their very being. The forge fire never died. Day and night, iron was shaped into death, into destiny. And when at last the longships were ready to carry them beyond their fjords, the first Vikings did not leave as farmers or fishermen. They left as wolves, armed with steel predators forged in fire. If weapons made the Vikings deadly, it was the longship that made them unstoppable. Without it, their fury would have remained trapped in fjords and forests. With it, they became a storm upon the seas. The first longship was not born from luxury, but from necessity. The north was a land of jagged coastlines, treacherous waters, and endless islands. To survive, the Norse needed vessels that could cut through waves, slide over shallow rivers, and even be dragged across land when needed. What they built was nothing short of revolutionary. Crafted from oak and bound by iron rivets, the longship was as flexible as it was strong. Its hull curved like the body of a serpent, able to bend with the sea instead of breaking against it. Unlike the clumsy merchant ships of the south, the longship was lean, sleek, and terrifyingly fast. With a single sail, it could fly across the open ocean. With oars, it could glide silently up rivers, carrying warriors straight into the hearts of unsuspecting towns. The prow of each ship was carved with beasts, dragons, wolves, serpents, meant to frighten both enemies and spirits alike. To see one cresting the horizon was to see death approaching. To hear the thunder of dozens of oars striking water in unison was to hear doom itself. But the genius of the longship was not just in its design, it was in its versatility. Unlike other ships of the age, the Viking longship could approach land without harbours. It could strike anywhere a fishing village, a monastery, a fortified town, then vanish back into the sea before armies could respond. No coastline was safe. The men who crewed these ships became as much a part of the vessel as the wood and iron themselves. Each oarsman rowed not as an individual, but as a piece of a living beast. They trained to move in perfect rhythm, their muscles burning, their hearts pounding as the sea roared beneath them. At the command of their Jarl, they could turn the ship with a single stroke, making it dance upon the waves with deadly precision. The longship was more than transport. It was a weapon, a floating war machine, and a home. Warriors slept beneath its deck, ate on its benches, and sharpened their blades to the sound of crashing waves. When storms rose, the ship did not cower it, sliced through them like a predator, carrying its crew toward their next conquest. It was this creation that changed everything. With the longship, the Vikings were no longer bound by the limits of their harsh homeland. Now the world itself was open to them. Rivers to raid, coasts to burn, kingdoms to shatter. And when the first fleet set sail, they did not carry merchants or pilgrims. They carried wolves of the sea, hungry for land, blood, and glory. The age of terror had found its wings. The world first learned the name Viking, not in council halls or on battlefields, but in fire. They came with the morning sun, when villages were still wrapped in sleep, when monks whispered their prayers in candlelit stone halls. It was then that the longships struck swift, silent, merciless. The first raids were small, almost experiments. A handful of warriors would beach their ships on foreign shores, slipping through the mist like phantoms. Armed with axes, swords, and shields, they descended upon unsuspecting hamlets. By the time the smoke rose and the cries echoed across the land, the ships were already gone, their hulls heavy with silver, slaves, and plunder. To those who witnessed them, the raiders seemed less like men and more like demons. They wore helmets of iron, some adorned with snarling beasts. Their shields gleamed with painted symbols of power. Their war cries split the morning silence like thunder. And behind it all came the roar of flames as entire villages were set alight. The most infamous of these early strikes came in the year 793 upon the holy island of Lindisfarne. Monks there had believed themselves safe, far removed from war and kings. But when the longships came, safety turned to ash. The raiders stormed the monastery, cutting down those who resisted, dragging away survivors in chains. Gold, relics, and manuscripts, treasures of the church, were ripped from sacred altars. To Christendom, it was more than violence. It was sacrilege, the wrath of heathen wolves unleashed upon holy ground. From that day, the world would never see the Norse the same way again. The word Viking became a curse, whispered with dread from Ireland to Francia, from Saxon England to the far reaches of the Baltic. To see a dragon-prowed ship on the horizon was to know terror had arrived. But for the Vikings themselves, these raids were more than blood and fire. They were lifelines. The silver they stole fed their clans. The captives they took became slaves, traded or put to work. Each raid strengthened their homelands, binding their people with wealth and stories of victory. The fjords echoed not only with the cries of plunder, but with the songs of skalds, weaving tales of men who braved the unknown and returned rich and feared. What set the Vikings apart was not just their brutality, but their brilliance. They struck where enemies were weakest, where no defense was prepared. They came not in massive armies, but in swift packs, leaving chaos in their wake. By the time kings gathered their forces, the raiders were long gone, their sails lost on the horizon. It was this style of warfare, sudden, savage, and precise, that made the world tremble. The raids were not random savagery. They were the first steps in a strategy that would soon see Viking power spread across continents. The dawn raids were only the beginning, for the wolves of the sea had tasted blood and the world was vast. For the Vikings, every raid carried promised silver, slaves, and songs of honor. But glory was never free. It demanded blood, theirs or their enemies. When a Viking warrior set foot on foreign soil, he did so knowing that only two fates awaited him, victory or death. To fall in battle was not shame, but destiny. The Norse believed that those slain with a weapon in hand were chosen by the Valkyries, swept away to Valhalla, where Odin himself awaited them. There, they would feast and fight forever, training for the final war at the end of days. This belief made them fearless, even reckless. While other soldiers broke ranks in terror, Vikings surged forward, shields locking, axes swinging. Each clash of iron was more than a fight for survival. It was a chance to earn eternal glory. Yet for every raid that returned with treasure, there were others that ended in disaster. Some ships vanished in storms, swallowed by the merciless sea. Others met armies too strong, and their crews were cut down to the last man. To raid was to gamble with fate itself, and many clans paid dearly. But it was not only foreign blades that claimed Viking lives. Among themselves, rivalries were as deadly as any Saxon spear. Blood feuds tore families apart, and the holmgang, a duel to the death, was a grim but accepted way of settling disputes. A man could gain honor through the killing of his own kin if the law of vengeance demanded it. And then there was the hunger. Raids filled the fjords with treasure, but winter came all the same. A failed harvest could make even a victorious warrior starve. The weak were left behind, and the strong grew harder, colder, more merciless. Glory came at a price not only of blood spilled abroad, but of suffering endured at home. The women, too, bore this cost. While the men sailed to raid, the women held the homesteads. They tended crops, raised children, and defended their halls if raiders came. Viking women could wield weapons when needed, and some became legendary shield maidens. But for most, glory was found in survival, keeping their families alive, while husbands, sons, and brothers gambled their lives for silver. Yet the blood price was more than hardship. It was a philosophy. To live as a Viking was to accept suffering, to embrace risk, to face the world without flinching. Every victory was sharpened by the knowledge that death was always near. Every feast tasted sweeter because tomorrow might bring the grave. It was this relentless acceptance of life's brutality that forged the Vikings into legends. Where others saw danger, they saw opportunity. Where others feared death, they sought it with pride. For the Norse, glory was never free. It was bought with iron, fire, and blood, and it was this price, paid again and again, that made their name echo across the ages. If Thor was the god of battle's thunder, Odin was its shadow, the whisper in the mind of every Viking who raised his sword. To the Norse, Odin was not merely a deity. He was the architect of fate, the father of kings, the patron of war, poetry, and wisdom. It was to Odin that the fiercest warriors prayed before battle, carving runes into their weapons and chanting his name beneath the beat of war drums. They believed that victory belonged to those who earned his favor, and death in his service was the highest honor. For Odin was not just a god of war, he was the keeper of Valhalla, where only the bravest of the slain were welcomed. The worship of Odin was not a gentle faith. It demanded sacrifice. Animals were slaughtered in his name, their blood spilled upon sacred stones. But in darker rituals, there were whispers of greater offerings, human sacrifices, bound captives given to the spear or the noose, for Odin was known as the god of the hanged. Priests of Odin, called Gotha, led ceremonies under open skies, where fire, mead, and blood mingled in the air. Warriors swore oaths upon sacred rings, calling Odin as witness, knowing that breaking such an oath would bring ruin upon their souls. Yet Odin was not worshipped by fear alone. He was revered because he embodied everything the Vikings valued. He was cunning, willing to sacrifice for knowledge, having plucked out one of his own eyes at Mimir's well in exchange for wisdom. He was relentless, having hung upon Yggdrasil, the world tree, pierced by his own spear for 9 nights, to discover the runes, the secrets of fate itself. He was the god who understood that greatness required suffering, and that no prize worth having came without pain. For the raiders, Odin was the voice that urged them to press forward when shields splintered and blood ran hot. For the skalds, he was the source of poetry, the one who inspired the sagas that would carry men's names into eternity. For kings, he was the patron who gave divine right to rule, the god whose favour meant the difference between a fleeting reign and a dynasty remembered for centuries. But to invoke Odin was also to invite peril. He was a trickster as much as a guide, a god who gave victory one day and ruin the next. Those who followed him knew that his gifts were dangerous, his bargains costly. To dedicate oneself to Odin was to step willingly into a pact with fate, a pact that often ended in blood. The cult of Odin gave the Vikings more than religion. It gave them a purpose larger than life, a vision of death as triumph, and a god who demanded courage above all else. With Odin in their hearts, they sailed into storms, faced armies larger than their own, and struck fear into the known world. And, with every raid, every sacrifice, Every oath sworn under the raven banners, the world came to know what it meant to follow the Allfather. Among the many symbols that haunted the battlefields of the Viking Age, none struck fear quite like the raven banner. Black, triangular, and adorned with the image of a raven, it was said to be more than a mere flag, it was a living omen. To the Vikings, ravens were sacred to Odin. They were his spies, Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, who flew across the world to bring him knowledge. Where ravens circled, Odin's gaze was near. To carry his bird into battle was to declare that the Allfather himself was watching, guiding, and judging. But the banner was not only symbolic. According to sagas, it carried a dreadful power. It was said that whenever the raven banner was raised, victory was assured, but always at a terrible cost. The battle would be won, but the standard bearer, the one who held the flag aloft, would fall. This gave the banner an aura of dread. Warriors honoured those who bore it, for they marched not only into the enemy's spears but into certain death. To carry the raven banner was to embrace fate itself, to die so that others might claim glory. Kings and jarls who raised the banner struck fear into their enemies. The sight of Odin's bird flapping above a wall of shields told foes that they were not merely fighting men, they were fighting destiny. And destiny was merciless. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells of Viking armies led by sons of Ragnar Lodbrok, men who raised the raven banner in their invasions of England. It was said that when the flag caught the wind, the raven upon it seemed to move, wings beating as if alive. Some swore that Odin's bird descended from the sky to feast upon the slain, guided by the very cloth that bore his image. For the Vikings themselves, the banner was both hope and warning. Its presence promised victory, but every man who looked at it knew that blood must be paid. The standard, bearer's sacrifice, was not a choice, it was woven into the fabric of fate. Even in death, the raven banner's shadow lingered. After great battles, survivors claimed to see ravens circling overhead, settling upon corpses, their black wings blotting out the Sunday. To the Vikings, this was not horror, but confirmation Odin had received his offering. The raven banner was more than warcloth. It was a pact between men and gods, a reminder that no victory came without sacrifice. Every time it was raised, it demanded blood, and every time, the Vikings gave it willingly. And so, wherever the raven flew, terror followed, not only for those who faced it, but for those who carried it, for in its shadow, death was always waiting. Among the fiercest of Viking warriors were the berserkers men who fought with such savage fury that even their own comrades feared them. They were not ordinary raiders. They were storm and madness given flesh, warriors who seemed to abandon all human restraint when battle began. The sagas describe them howling like wolves, biting their shields, and charging into enemy ranks without fear of death. Clad in the pelts of bears or wolves, they believed they could channel the spirits of these beasts, transforming into something more than human. To face a berserker was to face a man possessed, a living weapon who would not stop until blood was spilled. But their power came at a cost. The berserker's rage, known as Berserksganga, the berserk's fury, was said to be uncontrollable. In the heat of battle, they lost all sense of friend or foe. Stories tell of berserkers turning their fury upon their own comrades once the enemy was slain, unable to quench the fire burning inside them. Some believed their strength came from Odin himself, the god of war and frenzy. Others whispered darker tales, that berserkers were cursed, their rage not a gift but a punishment, a consuming madness that ate at their souls. In calmer times, they were outcasts. Few wished to share a hearth with men who could lose themselves so completely. Many berserkers wandered alone, shunned by their kin, feared for the violence that might erupt without warning. Even kings who employed them as bodyguards did so warily, knowing their loyalty was fragile, their wrath unpredictable. Yet in battle, no force was more terrifying. An enemy shield wall could be broken by a single berserker's charge, his wild fury scattering trained men who could not comprehend such madness. Armies spoke of them with dread, warning that where berserkers fought, the gods themselves walked beside the Vikings. But behind their legend lay tragedy. Some berserkers, when the fury passed, were left trembling, weakened, even broken. The sagas speak of warriors who wept after their fits of rage, unable to remember what they had done. Others fell into deep melancholy, haunted by the blood they had spilled. Their strength, it seemed, was borrowed from something beyond them, and when it left only ruin. The curse of the berserker was this: to live as both hero and monster, to be revered in war but feared in peace, to give glory to their people but never to know peace for themselves. And yet, when Viking longships carved through the seas, kings and jarls still sought them, for in the fury of the berserker, victory could be won, even if it was victory bought with madness. To the Vikings, the gods were not distant figures hidden away in the heavens. They were living forces that demanded tribute, loyalty, and blood. And when the people sought victory, harvest, or favour, sacrifices were offered, some small, some unspeakable. Animals were the most common offerings. Horses, cattle, goats, and pigs were slaughtered at sacred groves and temples, their blood sprinkled upon the idols of Odin, Thor, and Frey. Warriors drank the blood in ceremonial cups, believing it carried divine strength. The meat was then cooked and shared in great feasts, a communion between gods and men. But sometimes, animals were not enough. When a chieftain sought Odin's favour for war, or when famine threatened a community, human lives were given. Prisoners of war, slaves, and even volunteers were offered to the gods, their deaths carried out with ritual precision. Some were hanged in honour of Odin, who sacrificed himself upon Yggdrasil. Others were drowned, given to the sea goddess Ran. Some were even burned alive, so their ashes could rise as smoke to the heavens. The most infamous of these rituals took place at Uppsala in Sweden, where chroniclers described a grand temple surrounded by golden chains. Every 9 years, the people gathered for a great sacrifice. 9 males of every living creature were offered, including men. Their bodies were hung in the sacred grove, swaying among the branches, a grim reminder that the gods demanded a heavy price. For the Vikings, this was not cruelty, it was necessity. The gods had given them life, land, and battle glory. To repay that debt with blood was only just. To refuse would bring misfortune, storms at sea, or defeat in war. Warriors themselves sometimes chose sacrifice. To die as an offering to Odin was seen as an honour greater than dying on the battlefield. To be taken as the Allfather's chosen meant a direct path to Valhalla. Some men even volunteered to leap into the fire or tighten the noose around their own necks so their souls could be carried to the hall of the slain. Yet, for their enemies, the practice was horrifying. Christian monks who encountered these rituals wrote of them in shock, calling the Vikings heathens, barbarians, devils in human form. Tales spread of the dreaded blood eagle, a ritual in which a victim's back was carved open and their lungs pulled out like wings, offered to Odin as a final, gruesome gift. Whether myth or truth, the story alone was enough to strike terror in Viking foes. The sacrifices of blood and fire bound the Vikings to their gods in ways few outsiders could understand. It was a faith written in flesh, a devotion measured in lives. And to the Vikings, this was the price of power, a price they paid without hesitation. For the Vikings, the sea was more than a path to plunder, it was a kingdom of its own, vast and merciless. Those who ruled upon it were called sea kings, warlords without land who carved their power from the waves. They had no need of thrones or castles. Their longships were their crowns, and their crews were their kingdoms. A sea king was bound not by borders, but by an oath to the sea itself. To take such an oath was to renounce comfort and stability, to embrace a life of endless raids, storms, and bloodshed. It was a vow that only the strongest or the most desperate could uphold. They swore their allegiance beneath the stars, with the salt wind in their hair and the crash of waves in their ears. A sea king's oath was sealed with sacrifice, the spilling of blood upon the deck of a longship poured into the sea to honor Aegir, the god of the deep. Some even cut themselves, letting their own lifeblood drip into the ocean as a pledge that their fate would forever be tied to the waters. The oath was not only to the gods, but to the men who followed them. A crew trusted their sea king with their lives, for storms and battles alike demanded unity. A broken oath meant ruin, and any leader who faltered would be cast overboard, his body swallowed by the very sea he failed to master. Legends speak of sea kings, who commanded fleets so large they darkened the horizon. They raided far-off lands, from the misty coasts of Ireland to the glittering riches of Byzantium. Some were said to have sailed beyond the edges of the known world, where sea serpents writhed in the depths and islands of fire smoked on the horizon. But the oath came with a curse. The sea demanded everything. Many sea kings never saw old age, their lives claimed by storms or foreign blades. Those who survived were often restless, unable to live on land after years of salt and steel. Even in death, they were tied to the ocean. Crews buried their kings in longships set ablaze and cast adrift, their flames dancing upon the waves until the sea claimed them once more. The Sea King was both revered and feared, a wanderer, a raider, a master of men and waves. His oath was his soul, and as long as he kept it, his name lived on in sagas sung by skalds. For in Viking times, kings ruled land, but sea kings ruled eternity. In the age of the Vikings, battles were not decided only by strength of arms. Warriors believed that before a single axe was swung, or a single shield raised, the outcome was already written in the skies. And nothing struck more fear or pride into their hearts than the gathering of ravens. The raven was the bird of Odin, the Allfather, god of war, wisdom, and death. His two companions, Hugin and Munin, flew across the world each day, returning to whisper secrets into his ear. To see a raven before battle was no accident. It was a sign that Odin himself was watching, weighing the souls of those about to fight. If the birds circled above the Viking army, it was a promise of victory. Warriors shouted with joy, pounding their shields, for they believed Odin's favor would carry them forward. But if the ravens landed upon the enemy's side, dread spread through the ranks. Men whispered that Odin had already chosen who would fall, and none could escape his will. Ravens did not only predict war, they followed it. Where armies clashed, flocks of black wings gathered, waiting for the dead. The Vikings called them the feathered wolves of battle, scavengers who dined on the eyes of fallen men. Their presence was so common that Viking poetry was filled with grim boasts. I fed the ravens well today. To die and leave one's corpse to the birds was not shame, but proof of a warrior's life fulfilled. Sometimes, omens went beyond simple sightings. Chieftains spoke of dreams where ravens whispered in the night, telling them when to strike or when to hold back. Seers, the Vola, claimed they could speak with Odin's birds, learning the fates of men yet to die. Some warriors even carried raven banners, black flags, bearing the bird's image. When such a banner fluttered in the wind, it was said to terrify enemies, for it meant Odin himself flew with the Vikings. But the raven's blessing was never free. The god who sent them was also the god of death. A victory under Odin's eye came at a cost, for he demanded a share of the slain. Some warriors whispered that when a raven landed on a man's shield, it meant he had been chosen not for glory, but for sacrifice. He would fall in battle, his soul carried to Valhalla as payment for Odin's gift. Thus, when the ravens gathered, no Viking took it lightly. To them, it was more than a bird's flight. It was fate itself, written in black wings against the sky. And so, as the sagas say, where the raven flies, war is never far behind. The Vikings believed the world was marching toward its doom, and they called this dark future the Wolf Age. It was the age when brothers would slay brothers, when oaths would be broken, and when the wolves of chaos would roam free. To the Norse, it was not only a prophecy of the end, it was a reflection of their own violent age. The term came from the most feared beast of all, Fenrir, the monstrous wolf destined to devour Odin himself during Ragnarok. Bound by the gods in chains of magic, Fenrir bided his time, his eyes burning with hatred. But the sagas said that one day his bonds would break, and the sound of his howling would mark the beginning of the Wolf Age. To the Vikings, this prophecy was more than myth. They looked around their world and saw it unfolding before them. Kingdoms feuded endlessly, clans betrayed their kin, and blood feuds consumed generations. The Axe Age, the Sword Age, the Wind Age, the Wolf Age, their poets sang. A time of war and treachery, a time when no one could trust even their closest kin. In the Wolf Age, the gods themselves were not safe. The wolves, Skull and Hati, chased the sun and the moon across the heavens, hungering to devour them. Each eclipse, each blood-red moon, was seen as a sign that the wolves were drawing closer to their prey. When they finally caught them, the sky would fall into darkness, and the final war would begin. But Fenrir was not the only wolf the Vikings feared. The sagas tell of human wolves, two berserkers, who fought in a frenzy, their minds consumed by the spirit of the beast. These warriors were seen as both a blessing and a curse. They could break the enemy line in moments, tearing through men like wild animals, but they were unpredictable, their rage unstoppable, even by friend or kin. Many whispered that berserkers were proof the Wolf Age had already begun, for they lived outside the bounds of human law. The image of the wolf haunted the Viking imagination. To them, wolves were not just animals of the forest. They were the very embodiment of chaos and destruction. Yet they also admired their strength, their cunning, and their relentless hunger. In some ways, the Vikings saw themselves reflected in the wolf, predators roaming the world, feared by all, bound to a fate that could not be escaped. As the skalds sang, the Wolf Age was not only coming, it was already here. And every raid, every oath broken, every river of blood spilled across the earth brought Fenrir one step closer to freedom. The Vikings lived knowing the end was inevitable, yet instead of despair, this belief drove them to fight harder, raid farther, and seek glory in every deed. For if the Wolf Age could not be stopped, then the only choice was to meet it with axe in hand. Among all the tales of Viking cruelty, none strikes terror like the blood eagle. To this day, historians argue whether it was real or merely a legend, but in the sagas, it stands as the ultimate punishment, a death so horrific it turned enemies into warnings. The blood eagle was not simply an execution, it was a statement, a ritual meant to honor the gods of war and terrorize all who opposed the Vikings. According to the stories, the victim was pinned face down, often a captured king, noble, or traitor. Then, with axes and knives, the Viking executioners hacked through the ribs along the spine, pulling them open like wings. The lungs were dragged out and draped across the victim's back, creating the gruesome image of an eagle spreading its wings. It was said the victim must not cry out. If he endured the torment in silence, he was offered to Odin as a worthy sacrifice, his soul taken to Valhalla. But if he screamed, his dishonor would echo forever, remembered not as a warrior but as prey. The sagas tell us of King Ella of Northumbria, the man who killed the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. When Ragnar's sons returned to avenge their father, they captured Ella and carved the blood eagle upon his back. To the Vikings, this was justice, not cruelty. A king who fed Ragnar to the snakes would now feed Odin with his suffering. But was it real? Some scholars believe the blood eagle may have been symbolic, a poetic description of a brutal but ordinary execution. Yet to the Vikings themselves, truth and myth were not separate. What mattered was the fear it inspired. Enemies who heard the tale did not think of symbolism. They imagined their own lungs torn from their chest, their death turned into a feast for ravens. The ritual also carried deep meaning. The eagle was a bird sacred to Odin, soaring high above battlefields and carrying souls to the afterlife. To carve an eagle from the body of a man was to claim him for the gods. It was both a sacrifice and a curse, a way of saying, this man belongs to no kingdom, no kin, only to death itself. The thought of the blood eagle spread like wildfire across Europe. To monasteries and courts, it was proof of Viking savagery. To warriors, it was a whisper that disobedience could end in wings of blood. And to the Vikings, it was legend, a tale that magnified their terror, ensuring their enemies quaked before a single sword was raised. Whether real or not, the blood eagle became part of Viking identity. Merciless, unstoppable, feared above all. For in a world ruled by terror, even the story of such a death was as powerful as the act itself. The first Vikings didn't simply wander the coasts looking for trade. They came with axes sharpened, shields in hand, and eyes set on destruction. The early raids were swift, sudden, and brutal, a warning to all who underestimated them. Longships, sleek and silent in the moonlight, allowed them to strike where rivers met the sea. Villages believed themselves safe, nestled inland or behind palisades, but the Vikings were patient predators. They observed tides, seasons, and the rhythm of human complacency. When they struck, it was lightning fast. Monasteries were the first targets. Isolated, wealthy, and poorly defended, they held treasures of gold, silver, and sacred manuscripts. The Vikings didn't care about faith, only plunder. They stormed across wooden docks, cutting down monks with curved swords, dragging treasure into their boats, and leaving behind flames that lit the night sky. Smoke rose like a grim signal. The Vikings had arrived. But these raids weren't mindless chaos. They were lessons, teaching neighbouring villages the cost of ignoring the Norse. Survivors told stories of Viking warriors who fought like storms, who laughed while looting, and who disappeared as quickly as they came. That fear became their greatest weapon. Viking society prepared for this life from birth. Boys learned to row, to wield an axe, and to read the tides before they could even walk steadily. It was a world where hesitation could mean death, where bravery was measured in deeds, not words. Every raid honed skill, strengthened bonds, and solidified the legend of the Norse. Not all were warriors. Some Vikings acted as scouts, spies, and negotiators. They assessed targets from miles away, learned local customs, and even spoke the languages of those they would later terrorize. Intelligence was as deadly as a sword in their hands. The first raids were also experiments. Coastal villages that resisted were burned entirely. Those that surrendered quickly sometimes became allies or tributaries. The Vikings were not merely destroyers, they were strategists, building a network of fear and respect that would expand across seas and rivers. And yet, for all their violence, the first Vikings had rules, unspoken codes of honor. While cruelty was a weapon, betrayal of kin or cowardice in battle was unforgivable. Their reputation depended on fear, yes, but also on loyalty among their own. A raider who betrayed his brothers risked a death far worse than any enemy could impose. By the end of the first decade, tales of these Norse raiders spread from England to Ireland, from the coasts of Francia to the rivers of Eastern Europe. Legends of their longships, their thunderous war cries, and their unmatched ferocity grew larger with each telling. Fear became currency, and the Vikings spent it lavishly. In every burning village, in every stolen treasure, in every survivor's trembling tale, the first Vikings etched their presence onto history. They were more than men, they were inevitability, made flesh a storm that would not be denied. The North was a land where loyalty and treachery intertwined like the twisting roots of ancient forests. Among the first Vikings, family ties were sacred, yet ambition and pride often tore them apart. Long before raiding distant lands, they fought a war closer to home, one of honor, revenge, and betrayal. A slight insult, a disputed claim over land, or the greed for plunder could ignite a feud that lasted generations. Villages were small, and everyone knew each other's histories, weaknesses, and grudges. Even within families, rivalries festered. Sons challenged fathers to prove themselves worthy of leadership, and brothers schemed in secret, waiting for the opportune moment to seize power. A handshake could conceal deadly intent, and a feast could hide the plotting of murder. The first Vikings learned early that their fiercest enemies often wore familiar faces. The feud spilled into the wilderness and fjords, where smoke and fire became grim signals of a village under attack. Men raced to defend their homes, wielding axes and shields with deadly precision. Skirmishes erupted near frozen rivers or along cliffs, the echoes of battle carried by the icy wind. Those who survived needed more than brute strength. They needed cunning, alliances, and an understanding of human nature sharper than any sword. Negotiation was as dangerous as combat. A single misstep in words could turn allies into enemies. Marriage ties could be broken, property seized, and lives lost over the smallest perceived insult. The first Vikings developed a keen sense for reading intentions, detecting lies, and striking before the enemy expected it. They became masters of both war and politics, understanding that survival required both courage and intelligence. Even in victory, trust was scarce. Celebrations were often muted, as any display of weakness or arrogance could invite betrayal. Those who ruled without foresight rarely lasted, for ambition among younger warriors always simmered beneath the surface. The first Vikings understood that family could kill as easily as a stranger, and the wise knew when to strike and when to wait. Through these trials, a generation of formidable warriors emerged. Feuds hardened them, but they also sharpened their wits and honed their reflexes. Every betrayal taught them the harsh realities of their world. Life was fleeting, trust was fragile, and only the cunning survived. Blood ties, while sacred, were fragile threads in a tapestry woven with violence and ambition. By the end of this chapter in their lives, the first Vikings had learned a lesson that would define their people for centuries. Loyalty was precious, but betrayal was inevitable. Those who mastered both the sword and the mind could not only survive, but thrive. In the icy north, strength alone would not save a man. Only strategy, courage, and ruthlessness could secure his place in history. The sea was more than water to the first Vikings. It was both cradle and executioner. Its waves carried promise and peril, whispering tales of distant lands, hidden treasures, and lurking death. From the moment a boy could lift an oar, he was taught to respect the ocean's rhythm, to read the wind, the clouds, and the stars. The sea demanded obedience, and disobedience could be fatal. Ships were extensions of the warriors themselves. The longship, sleek and low, was a marvel of wood and iron, designed to cut through waves and slip past enemies unnoticed. Every plank was cared for, every sail adjusted, every oar synchronized in a dance of survival. A single mistake, one unbalanced oar, one poorly tied rope, could mean capsizing, drowning, or abandonment in icy waters far from home. For the first Vikings, the ocean was both battlefield and teacher. Yet it was not only fear that drew them. Adventure pulsed in every heartbeat. Tales of unknown coasts, strange peoples, and bountiful harvests from foreign lands fueled their ambitions. The sea called like a siren, demanding courage and daring. Those who heeded it became legends, their names carried on the wind like whispers of power. Those who hesitated often became cautionary tales, their bones scattered on forgotten shores. Raiding, in particular, tested everything. Warriors learned that timing, speed, and stealth were paramount. Approaching a village at dawn, they struck like shadows, axes glinting, shields raised. The sea had taught them patience, wait for the tide, the fog, the moment when their enemies' defences were weakest, and when the attack succeeded, the spoils were sweet but fleeting. The sea never allowed complacency. Storms, pirates, or misjudged tides could strip victory in an instant. Survival depended not only on strength, but on unity. The crew was family, bound by blood and shared peril. Arguments could erupt during long voyages, but discipline was enforced with iron resolve. A deserter or coward endangered everyone, and the first Vikings learned that mercy was a luxury they could not afford. Bonds forged on water were stronger than any forged on land, tempered by salt, wind, and the ever-present threat of death. The sea also taught humility. Mighty warriors could be humbled by a sudden storm, swept off decks, or dashed against hidden rocks. Hunger, cold, and exhaustion were constant companions, yet they built resilience. Each voyage honed instincts, sharpened reflexes, and revealed the limits of human endurance. Those who mastered the waves gained not only riches, but respect and a place in the oral histories passed down through generations. By the end of each journey, the first Vikings understood a truth that would define their culture. The sea was life, death, and destiny all at once. To conquer it, they had to embrace both fear and courage, strategy and instinct. Every wave carried lessons in survival, and every storm tested the mettle of those who called themselves Vikings. In the north, mastery of the ocean was mastery of fate itself. The fire was never just warmth to the first Vikings, it was life, protection, and a symbol of power. In the longhouses, the hearth burned steadily, its flames a constant presence against the bitter northern cold. The first Vikings understood fire's dual nature. It could nurture crops and cook food, or it could consume everything in a blaze of destruction. Mastery over fire became a defining trait of survival. Every home, no matter how modest, had a hearth at its centre. Smoke curled upward through holes in the roof, carrying with it the scents of roasting meats, smouldering herbs, and the ever-present aroma of charred wood. These smells were both comforting and alarming. To a stranger, it might seem homely, but the first Vikings knew that fire demanded vigilance. One misstep, a spark landing on a pile of straw, a forgotten ember could erase a family in minutes. Fire was also a weapon. Raiding parties carried torches as they approached enemy villages under the cloak of night. The crackle of flames heralded terror. Wooden homes, poorly defended, fell quickly, their occupants scrambling while Vikings claimed spoils and glory. Fire consumed what axes could not reach, and the stories of entire settlements reduced to ash spread fear faster than any warrior could march. For the first Vikings, fire was both shield and sword, a tool to control not just the physical world but the psyche of their enemies. Yet fire was more than destruction, it was ritual. Around blazing hearths, elders passed down knowledge, myths, and the oral histories of warriors who had come before. Children learned of gods and monsters, of battles won and lost, of courage and cunning. Tales were punctuated by sparks flying upward, the dance of flame mirrored in the imagination of listeners. Fire became a teacher, igniting curiosity and shaping minds. The control of fire also demanded ingenuity. The first Vikings experimented with techniques to make it last longer, to ignite it under wet conditions, and to harness it for metallurgy. Weapons and tools were forged in flames that reached unimaginable heat, tempered to endure battle. Fire was the hidden hand behind every sword, every axe, and every shield. Its mastery separated survival from failure. Fire, however, also revealed human vulnerability. In winter, when the nights were long and darkness oppressive, those who failed to maintain the hearth faced frostbite, starvation, or death. A longhouse without fire was a tomb, and the first Vikings learned early that the neglect of such a basic necessity was unforgivable. By the time the flames died down each night, they left behind more than warmth. They left knowledge, power, and a reminder of human fragility. The first Vikings knew that their existence hinged on constant vigilance, ingenuity, and respect for the destructive and sustaining force at the center of their world. Fire was survival incarnate. It tested courage, rewarded skill, and punished carelessness. In every spark danced a lesson: respect it, master it, or perish. For the first Vikings, the sea was both cradle and crucible. It shaped their bodies, their minds, and their culture in ways that no landlocked life could ever imagine. From the earliest days, the ocean was not something to conquer, it was something to respect, to read, and sometimes to fear. Its moods were unpredictable, and its punishments swift. A calm morning could become a stormy nightmare by noon, waves smashing against the longship, threatening to swallow even the most experienced sailor. The first Vikings grew up with salt in their hair and calluses on their hands. Boys were taught to row before they could walk properly, and girls learned to weave nets and mend sails. Life revolved around tides and winds, the turning of the moon, and the songs of seabirds. Knowledge of the sea was survival knowledge. A misjudged current could leave a crew stranded. A misread sky could doom an entire expedition. The ocean was the ultimate teacher, and it demanded respect, cunning, and endurance. Longships were masterpieces of adaptability. Lightweight but sturdy, they could glide across shallow rivers, open seas, and rocky shores with equal efficiency. Building one required skill, patience, and communal effort, and the finished vessel was more than transportation, it was a lifeline. Each plank, nail, and rope was a testament to the craftsmanship and knowledge that the first Vikings carried through generations. Yet the sea also demanded bravery. Raiding, trading, or simply moving from fjord to fjord meant leaving behind safety. Storms were relentless, and the cold gnawed at flesh and bone. Legends speak of entire crews lost to whirlpools, sudden gales, or hidden rocks. But those who mastered the waters became untouchable, feared by coastal villages far and wide. The ocean forged warriors, not just sailors. It tempered patience, endurance, and the willingness to act decisively under pressure. Food and water at sea were never guaranteed. Sailors learned to ration, to fish, and to drink sparingly. Every voyage was a lesson in survival, every journey a story of cunning, cooperation, and sheer stubbornness. These hardships, repeated over years and decades, created the first Vikings' resilience, a stubbornness that would become their signature. The sea also carried secrets, islands, hidden coves, and distant lands that promised riches or doom. The first Vikings explored with both curiosity and calculation. They mapped coastlines in memory, learning the rhythm of waves, the warning cries of birds, and the smell of approaching land. This intimate knowledge allowed them to strike unpredictably, retreat when necessary, and thrive where others would perish. In winter, when the waters turned grey and storms raged without mercy, the sea tested even the strongest. Only those who respected its power survived. By the time spring arrived, the survivors had been shaped physically, mentally, and spiritually into beings uniquely equipped to endure anything, the first Vikings. For them, the ocean was not a backdrop. It was a companion, a teacher, and a rival. Every wave, every gust of wind, and every shadowed cove told stories of survival and triumph. The sea gave them freedom, shaped their destiny, and forged the warriors who would terrify distant lands. To live without it was impossible, to understand it was survival, and to master it, however fleeting, was glory. The first Vikings were born into a world where fire and blood were constant companions, life was harsh, and death lurked in every shadow. From an early age, they learned that survival depended on courage, skill, and the ability to face violence without hesitation. The fires that warmed their homes were the same fires that could consume them if misused, and the blood spilled in battles or sacrifices was a reminder of the fragile boundary between life and death. Villages were small, scattered, and often vulnerable. Raiders could strike without warning, and the first Vikings knew that protection meant preparedness. Every young warrior trained in combat as soon as he could walk. Axes, swords, and spears weren't toys, they were tools of survival. Girls learned too, not always in combat but in endurance, resilience, and managing resources during long absences of warriors. The community thrived on unity, discipline, and shared courage. Rituals around fire and blood were central to their identity. Bonfires marked seasonal changes, victories, and funerals. Flames danced with shadows, illuminating faces scarred by battle and weather, while the smell of smoked meat and burning timber filled the air. Blood, whether from ritual sacrifices or the battlefield, carried weight. It wasn't senseless violence, it was a bond to the gods, a contract with life itself, a reminder that strength demanded price. The first Vikings also understood fear and how to wield it. The sound of a longship's prow cutting through mist, the clash of weapons in a raid, the roar of warriors shouting, all served to terrify their enemies before the first arrow flew. It wasn't just brute force, it was psychological warfare. They knew that fear could topple walls as effectively as siege engines, that hesitation in the hearts of foes could be as lethal as a sword. Feasting after battle or harvest combined fire, food, and ritual. Large cauldrons bubbled over open flames, cooking meat that would nourish warriors and villagers alike. Songs and stories of gods, heroes, and ancestors were sung around the fire, teaching lessons, glorifying victories, and warning of hubris. In those moments, the first Vikings were bound together, a living embodiment of a culture forged in flame and tempered by blood. Yet life wasn't just about war. Fire was warmth, light, and protection. Blood was life, kinship, and continuity. Understanding these dualities was essential to survive. The first Vikings had to balance aggression with strategy, courage with caution, and reverence with practicality. Every day was a lesson, every decision a measure of skill, and every night around the fire a meditation on mortality. To live among fire and blood was to accept danger as a constant. And from this crucible emerged warriors capable of facing storms, rivals, and distant lands with the same fearless determination. The first Vikings didn't just survive, they thrived, shaped by the elements and their own relentless will, leaving a legacy written in the flames and etched in the stories of those who lived to tell it. The first Vikings were born beside the roar of waves and the scent of salt in the wind. The sea was their cradle and their battlefield, a vast and unpredictable force that demanded respect, cunning, and courage. From a young age, they learned to read the water, to sense storms brewing on the horizon, to understand the subtle shifts in tide and wind. Every wave carried both opportunity and threat. It was a teacher as harsh as any battle-hardened warrior. Their longships were more than mere vessels. They were extensions of themselves. Sleek, narrow, and designed to glide silently through water, these ships could carry warriors across fjords, rivers, and open seas with astonishing speed. Children learned the rhythm of the oars before they could properly run. Every knot tied, every plank caulked, every sail hoisted was a skill passed down from parent to child, a survival code encoded in wood and rope. The sea demanded respect. Storms could appear without warning, waves taller than the tallest warrior crashing against fragile hulls. Many perished learning this lesson, swallowed by icy waters or dashed against jagged rocks. Yet those who mastered it were unmatched, able to navigate treacherous currents, raid distant lands, and return home laden with riches and stories. The sea wasn't just a path, it was a proving ground, and only the bold or desperate dared to answer its call. Raiding across the water required more than courage. It required precision, coordination, and strategy. Early Vikings studied the patterns of coastal settlements, noting defenses, escape routes, and weak points. They struck with suddenness, using the element of surprise to their advantage. A longship appearing over the horizon could spark panic before a sword was drawn. These were not mindless marauders. They were disciplined predators of the coastline, blending knowledge of terrain with naval prowess. Life on the sea also demanded resilience. Food was limited, storms raged, and sleep came in stolen moments while keeping a careful watch. Illnesses, scurvy, and injuries were constant threats, and the cold gnawed at bones as relentlessly as the waves. Yet in the shared struggle, bonds were forged stronger than steel. Crews became families, reliant on one another for survival, laughter, and encouragement in equal measure. The sea was also spiritual. Legends told of gods and spirits who governed the waters, punishing the arrogant and guiding the faithful. Offerings were cast into the waves, prayers whispered before long journeys, and songs sung to steady nerves against fear of the unknown. For the first Vikings, the line between reality and myth was fluid as the sea itself. It demanded both skill and faith, courage and humility. To answer the call of the sea was to embrace risk, adventure, and the unknown. It shaped the first Vikings into explorers, raiders, and navigators of unmatched skill. Their lives were measured not by the safety of the shore, but by the challenges of the horizon. Every voyage was a story, every landing a chance to carve history, and every return home a testament to endurance. The sea didn't just test them, it defined them, forging a people who would leave footprints and longships etched forever into the memory of the world. The first Vikings left more than footprints in mud and sand. They left a legacy that would echo through centuries. They were born of harsh winters, jagged cliffs, and the relentless pull of the sea, forged by adversity into a people both feared and admired. Their stories were carved into runestones, whispered in sagas, and carried across the waters they once dominated. To understand them is to see the origins of a culture that thrived on courage, cunning, and the relentless pursuit of survival. These early warriors were not only raiders, but explorers, navigating coastlines and rivers far beyond the lands of their ancestors. Their longships carried them to shores unimagined, where they traded, fought, and sometimes settled. Each expedition was a test of skill, endurance, and wit, for the sea and the unknown were merciless teachers. They mapped the contours of distant lands with an accuracy that astonishes modern historians, leaving traces of their passage in names, artifacts, and stories. Life among the first Vikings was brutal yet profoundly structured. Daily survival demanded strength and intelligence, from hunting and fishing to crafting weapons, clothes, and tools. Every member of a village had a role, and children were trained from infancy to read the skies, the winds, and the waves. Discipline, courage, and adaptability were ingrained, producing a generation that could face danger with both strategy and fearlessness. Failure often meant death, but those who succeeded became legends, celebrated in song and story. The first Vikings were also deeply spiritual. Their understanding of the world was intertwined with the divine, believing gods and spirits influenced every wind, wave, and battle. Offerings and rituals were performed to ensure safe passage, successful hunts, or victory in raids. These beliefs were not mere superstition. They were guiding principles, shaping decision-making, alliances, and the rhythm of daily life. Honor, courage, and loyalty were intertwined with their faith, creating a culture in which reputation could determine life or death. Their legacy extended beyond battle and exploration. They influenced trade routes, introduced innovations in shipbuilding, and left a lasting impact on the cultures they encountered. From the markets of Constantinople to the rivers of England, their presence reshaped economies, politics, and societies. Their stories, once passed orally by minstrels and skalds, became a foundation for literature, myth, and history. Every victory, failure, and daring voyage contributed to a shared memory that endured long after their axes were laid to rest. Ultimately, the first Vikings were defined by their relentless drive to push boundaries, both geographic and personal. They embraced risk, valued skill, and celebrated ingenuity. They forged a path through uncertainty, leaving a world more connected, stories richer, and legends more vivid. To trace their origins is to understand the birth of a culture that thrived on courage, curiosity, and defiance of the ordinary. Their lives were short, often harsh, but their impact was eternal. The first Vikings remind us that greatness is rarely gentle, that survival demands audacity, and that the echoes of courage can outlast empires. To study them is to hear the roar of the sea, the clash of iron, and the songs of those who refuse to be forgotten. Their legacy is not merely in conquest, but in shaping the spirit of exploration, adventure, and resilience that endures to this day.